In a previous video, I made a distinction between things a civilization invented and things whose earliest archaeological examples belong to a certain civilization. Ancient Egypt has a long list of the latter sort, partly because of its desert surroundings. Water in the form of rainfall and a high water table is deadly to archaeological evidence, particularly because so many ancient artifacts made use of materials such as wood, bone, and hides. In a wet environment like Britain, we have an awful lot of stone, pottery, and rusted metal, but we're very lucky if we find anything with significant amounts of organic material. In the deserts surrounding the Nile Valley, however, moisture is wicked away by the sand, so it's not just human remains that are desiccated. Couple that with the Egyptians genuinely being one of the first civilizations to develop writing, and therefore history, and it looks like they came up with a lot of things before anyone else. But there's no reason to think the Egyptians, or rather their prehistoric ancestors, were any smarter than anyone else. Necessity is the mother of invention. The Egyptians were amazing at intensive agriculture because they couldn't rely on forage and hunting. For that, you need a degree of mobility for natural stocks to replenish. The Nile gave an annual gift in the form of water and fertile earth, and the Egyptians learned to exploit those resources as effectively as possible. In this video, I want to talk about two and a bit Egyptian firsts that I think are particularly interesting. Not that the Egyptians came up with them and taught the rest of the world about them. This isn't about bragging on the part of the ancient Egyptians, but it's always interesting and often surprising to know how far back a thing goes in human history, or in the case of my first example, how far back it doesn't go. There are a couple of asterisks that apply to both of these things. The first is that dating techniques that we have allow for a lot of imprecision. So a lot of the time, all we can really get is a date range, sometimes with millennia in the margin for error. The second asterisk is that archaeology, like all empirical sciences, is a falsification game. So these are the earliest examples of a thing to date. Evidence of human civilization the world over is being uncovered all the time, so who knows what the records will be a year from now. The first is the earliest named human. I've mentioned this in previous videos, but this is the time to go into a bit of detail. Humans have been around in our current form for a very long time, 300,000 years or thereabouts. Evidence on spoken language is, by definition, absent, since there was no means to record it, but anatomically modern humans have been around for 1/3 years. Go back in time, take a human baby from the 280th millennium BCE, bring it back here, and raise it, and it would blend in pretty much perfectly with us. Remember, there are no primitive people, only primitive technology, and primitive just means early. It doesn't mean bad. These humans, for example, would certainly have been able to speak, and given how much of the human brain is devoted to the acquisition and replication of language, it seems inevitable that they would have done. Not all languages are equally complex, but at the very least it seems likely that objects and people would have been discerned with names. Keep that in mind when I tell you that the earliest known human name is probably this, Irihor, which dates to around 3150 BCE. Obviously, by no means was this man the first human with a name. In fact, Irihor might not have been his name at all. It may have been a label designating this person as property of the king. But with early hieroglyphs, it's impossible to determine the difference between names and labels. Irihor has competition from Mesopotamia, namely from the Keshim tablet. Its date of origin places it either sometime before or sometime after Irihor, and Keshim, like Irihor, may have been a name or a title. If either of these are names, though, consider the magnificent power of written language as a tool for transmitting information. Oral histories are not inherently inferior to written ones, and have some advantages, but here are possibly the names of two men who would have stood no chance of being remembered had their names not been written. Although, of course, we're not 100% sure how either of them were pronounced, so we couldn't exactly hop into our time machine and ask for them by name. If Stone Age humans were indistinguishable from us in terms of their mental capacities, then we have to acknowledge that they were as curious and observant as we are, perhaps even more so on a personal level, since so many of us can take our survival for granted. The sky's inhabitants, sun, moon, and stars, move in cycles, as do the seasons, the weather, the growth of edible plants, and the roaming of the herds. Matching these cycles and using them as tools of prediction is not an example of mysticism, but an absolutely essential tool for knowing what you need to be doing now and in the coming months. Far into the Pharaonic Age, importance was placed on certain celestial bodies. The sun, of course, the great giver of life, the moon, which gave the Egyptians their months, just as it indirectly gives us hours, and the cycle of certain stars defined periods of time and had ceremonial importance as a result. One of Egypt's most exciting archaeological regions is Nabta Playa, since it has given us a lot of evidence of the lives and practices of Neolithic Egyptians around 10,000 years ago. This is a reconstruction of a set of standing stones found in the region. They appear to map certain important stars, such as Orion's belt, at two different eras, marking the fact that the people of Nabta Playa were aware of gradual changes to the night sky. Whether this was a calculation in advance or an observation after a long period of time is difficult to know for sure because of that huge margin of error we talked about. But either way, it's quite impressive, and marks the earliest known example of a record of its type. It's not considered precise enough to have the predictive power to be useful as a calendar, but it's pretty accurate, and it does record an actual change that took place in the night sky. And I don't think people do that without a very good reason to do so. Maybe. Debatably. More on that next week. There are far more Egyptian firsts than these two and a bit that I think are particularly interesting, but for whatever reason these are the ones that appealed to me this time. As always, let me know if you're interested in more. I think I'll do videos more like this, where I look at a couple of specific examples and go into why I think they're interesting. A bland list of things doesn't need a YouTube video. Does any of this need YouTube videos? You know, need is a funny thing. In some way, until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity, and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community, there's an invite link in the description.